Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to the Lessons of Vietnam, where we tell the real story of the American War and of Vietnam and the men and women who fought it, trying to dispel some of the myths and stuff out there. My name is Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran, 67, 68, TET survivor, broadcasting here from international headquarters of the Nissan Communication Studio in Raleigh, North Carolina, just on the edge of Cary. You could. If you missed the live broadcast, and you're tuning in on archives. Thank you for coming in on archives and seeing the show. We have a special show tonight, and let's talk a little bit about how that you can come back in and view it later. To view it as you're on the air now would be ncvi.org. Click on TV show for the live show. Of course, it's 8 to 9 p.m. on the second and fourth Wednesday. Be sure and tell all your friends about it. You already have this information, or you wouldn't be listening to my voice now. But you can also come back and see some of the probably somewhere around 70 shows we've done here with all kinds of guests and subjects and so forth. You can go to the same way, ncvi.org, TV show, and then click on archives and just select the show you'd like. But tune in some of the other shows. To be part of the show during the evening, dial 919-518-9773, or even better, go on to Skype. That's Computers 2K Voice. K is a capital K, Voice. And if you want to get some information to me, just go to Lessons of Vietnam at ncvi.org and send me an email. So that's kind of gets you going. I just wanted to bring up, again, the attention out there that we all need to be aware of. There's 22 veterans who commit suicide every day. No excuse for this country to have that. We need to reach out to and touch these veterans. Anybody that you know that you feel like is having problems, dial the 1-800-273-8255 and press 1. And get that information to help this particular vet that you know of. And if you're a vet out there, there's help out there for those demons. And whatever it is, we can all solve it by working together. Get in touch with us or get in touch with the Veterans Crisis Line. All right, now we're going to tell you a little bit about the show. A little while ago, we did a symposium at the North Carolina History Museum. And it was a subject I had been working on for quite some time. Vietnam, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, and Afghanistan, similarities and differences. Now, we all get together and talk about our war, because our war was the worst war, and we went through a whole lot more than the other guys did in the war. They said that in World War II. They said that in Korea. We said that in Vietnam. Just like the guys in Gulf War I and II and Afghanistan have said it. If it's your war and you're in it, it's the worst war there was. Either way you look at it, there were some things that are different from Vietnam War that was worse than what the guys in Gulf War and Gulf II went through, but there's still things in Gulf War and Gulf II and Afghanistan went through that are different than Vietnam. So we are going to be discussing some of the similarities and some of the difference in the show tonight. We will not get all the way through the recorded symposium. We'll finish it up next show, but let's go ahead and get started and get on. Learn a lot of things and enjoy the show. So just sit back and enjoy. My name is Bill Dixon. I'm a member of North Carolina Vietnam Veterans Incorporated. I was in Vietnam in 1967, 1968. I'm a TET survivor, and one of the panelists have put all this together. So, and next to me I have he's going to do a little bit of all of it. He's going to do Vietnam and little bit of Gulf One, and he just retired, being a sergeant major for how long?
I retired in '05.
'05. Okay, but still working in the military, doing things. I'm gonna let him tell you what he does and who he is.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. My name's Andrew Jackson. I'm a retired command sergeant major from the Guard. Spent 3 years active duty, one of those in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division, 7 to 68. ETS'd in 1969, joined the Guard in 1978, retired in '05. I walked out of the office in uniform on a Wednesday and back into the military center on the following Monday in civilian clothes, and been there ever since. Doing first couple of years, I was the military funeral honors director. Started up a program there to assist in doing military funerals around the state. Then took this job I have now, which is transition assistance advisor. But basically, the name used to be benefits advisor, to give you an idea of what I do. I'm there to help soldiers or veterans or anyone that calls me, any kind of military aid, doesn't matter what status or anything. I help them with issues, particularly VA issues, things like that. And I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
My name is Chris Mooring. I'm a retired infantry first sergeant. I retired just this past October. I did 26 years. 20 years of that was federal service. I deployed to Iraq in 2004, 2005, and 2009, 2010 as infantry squad leader and as an infantry platoon sergeant. Currently now I'm a DoD contractor, and I work for the North Carolina National Guard in the Military Funeral Honors Program. So I'm the state program manager. I work with all funeral directors and funeral homes within all 100 counties of the state, as well as Fort Bragg, Shaw Air Force Base, and Seymour Johnson Air Force Base within North Carolina. And I'm just glad to be here and very appreciative. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Well, it seems like I'm the junior enlisted guy out of all you guys. I was a hospital corpsman stationed with the Marines and joined in '97. I was medically retired out in 2006. I've been in Afghanistan '01, '02, Iraq '03, '04, back over there '05, '06. And now I work for the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, specifically the Vet Center program here in Raleigh, and I'm the outreach coordinator.
First subject is be entering the military. Back in our time, and you had several choices. You got a letter from Uncle Sam saying greetings, means you were drafted, and then later in '69, I believe they went to the lottery, which is a little different than the original draft, which was through your local draft board. Sometimes, back in our day, the judge said that you were a choice between going to jail or going to the military, and so that was kind of the ways we got into the military back in those times. You got in about, were you were RA to start with, regular Army? Did you join?
I joined. I enlisted in '66 and ETS'd in '69.
I joined the Army to beat the draft, not to go to Vietnam.
No, I joined for Barry Sadler got me into the Army when he came out with a Green Beret and that song and all of that stuff and the hype that went along with it. And plus my brother came home with he was with the 82nd Airborne MPs at the time, and he came home on leave a couple of times with his shiny boots and his cocked hat and the old jump hat I know many of you remember. And Army was the only thing for me from then on. I had two brothers in the Navy. My dad was in the Navy, and one brother in the Army, and that was the way I went.
Well, I was out at what's now Wake Tech. It was WW Holding at the time, and I graduated and couldn't get a job. And I was married at the time and couldn't get a job. So I went down and talked to a recruiter. The recruiter told me that if I joined for 4 years, he never told me I could join for 2. He told me if I joined for 4 years, I could choose my school and I could choose my location. And I chose engineering. And I know the recruiter didn't lie, but my ticket to Germany, my choice, it's been lost in the mail now for almost 47 years. I know it's coming any day now.
Well, mine was actually erased. From the time I left the reception station, I enlisted to be an airborne MP with hopes of going Special Forces. And they agreed to all of that on my enlistment papers. But by the time I got to Fort Bragg, about midway through basic, I got a copy of my enlistment papers and saw where it actually physically had been erased there were choices in the block, and 11 Bravo Infantry entered into it. So I went, of course, to the chaplain first, and then they're in the command section and all that sort of stuff. But after a week or two, pretty much got, suck it up. You're not going to either one of them because you're colorblind, which was partially colorblind, but you know, that was why I ended up being taken out of it. So.
Okay. Same question. How did you enter the military, and how did you get to where you were, and so forth?
Well, I basically started the military, or should I say, let me back up just a little bit. Mine is kind of a little unique as far as why I joined. My father was drafted to go to Vietnam, but unfortunately was sent to Germany versus Vietnam, and my uncle was the opposite. He actually went to Vietnam. So they instilled on me real early, you know, the price of freedom and what that price was. So early on, I knew I wanted to join. Matter of fact, as I was coming through high school, my parents thought they would try to talk me out of joining and carried me to go see an Oliver Stone movie called Platoon, thinking that was going to change my mind. It actually made me want to do it more. On the beginning of what was then known Desert Shield, I went to an Army recruiter's office. I had just turned 18, and I signed up for the infantry active duty. And I'll never forget the recruiter looking at me saying, "Son, do you realize we're on the eve of war and you want to go be an infantryman?" I said, "Yes, sir, where do I sign?" And that started my career. I finished those 4 years of active duty. Once I finished those 4 years of active duty, then I rolled over into the National Guard, and then the rest is history.
Okay. I joined in 1997. My story is a little bit different because I was in college at the time in University of Maryland, and I was a bit of a smart aleck. I kind of got in trouble and kind of lost a JRTC scholarship. Well, I was going to be on probation, and because I was a first generation like person in my family to make it to college, let alone get some money for it, I didn't want to hear lip from my parents, particularly of their Asian descent, and my dad was in the Navy and a Vietnam vet, which I wasn't really paying attention to at the time. So I walked in each of the branches of services, Army, Marine Corps, Air Force, and the Navy was going to give me the first flight out of there compared to the other 3 branches of service. With my ASVAB score, I scored pretty well, so they said Nuke Tech or Corpsman, and they sold it to me like I was going to work at a hospital working with some nurses and doctors. So I joined the Navy. Once I joined and at boot camp and Corps school, later did I find out that the Marines don't have medics and they get it from the Navy. So they showed us a nice little movie, like Full Metal Jacket, said that guy was yelling out, "Doc, that's you guys getting shot at." And that guy actually died. So don't be here and run out all the time when you hear the word "doc," but that never really changed our training. So I ended up being with the Marines all 9 years.
Worked out great. The next subject is how were you deployed? I tell you what, guys, if you, especially Vietnam vets, I can realize this. Get on an airplane with a couple hundred other men going to a place you know nothing about, to war you don't know a whole lot about, is a frightening experience. I know you see guys on TV now, they got their weapons, they got all their uniform and so forth. I got on a military plane. They wouldn't even let me fly a Brandon like most of you guys would. I got on a military plane, and my flight attendant was not one of the nice looking stewardesses. It was, well, he was a loadmaster, and there was nothing nice looking about him at all. But I got, after I got out of basic training at Fort Bragg, I went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, got my orders for Vietnam. My training for Vietnam was, they said, "We got to give you specialized training." They put me on a bus, carried me to Fort Lee, Virginia, gave me an M16. I shot 2 clips, didn't even have to clean it. I just turned it back in and got on the bus. They said, "Okay, you're now trained for Vietnam." So I got on the plane, flying over to Vietnam. Military plane had problems. We landed at Wake Island in the middle of a monsoon. They worked on the plane the rest of the night. We took off from then and went to Guam. They worked on the plane there for 4 hours, and then I landed at Benoit Air Base. And I was a private E1. There's nothing lower than a private E1, even a slug or a leech. I got off the plane, and I was lucky enough, the guy came up to me and says, "We want you on KP." For my first 12 hours in Vietnam, I'm washing dishes and peeling potatoes. But I arrived in Vietnam with no weapon, no uniform, no nothing, because they gave it to you when you got assigned to your unit. You went over a little different. You had a group that you were already part of.
No, the unit, in the outset of the war, most of the units went over as units, or most of the soldiers went over as congealed units. They had been together for a while, but after a number of years, it went pretty much to just being replacements. You got out of basic training, you were sent to Korea, Vietnam, Germany, wherever, and showed up over there as an individual. You flew over in an airplane with many, many other soldiers, as I did, but you were really alone, because most of the people you had no idea who they were on the plane unless somebody was sitting right by next to you. And when you got off at Benoit, you were assigned to a unit, picked up and taken up to that unit. But the biggest impact I had with that particular part of it was I remember flying into Benoit and looking out the plane. We were in commercial airplanes in the old khaki uniforms, dress uniforms, and I remember looking down, it was daylight, and all I could see was bomb craters as we were making our base turn into Benoit Air Base. And all I could see was craters. And I was thinking, now what the hell have I gotten myself into? But obviously most of it was H&Is, or harassment and interdiction fires, that our guys were putting out in certain areas of the location and in certain areas around Benoit, just as interdictions, trying to make sure nothing was out there, that type of thing. So,
same question.
So basically, for both my deployments in 2004 and in 2009, we deployed as an entire unit, because obviously we were a National Guard unit. We actually went as an entire brigade. The first deployment, we were a little over 3,500 strong. We deployed as a heavy brigade. The first deployment, our actual flight over there was much like yours, in the belly of a C-5, flying with our equipment. The only difference was we had our gear, all of our weapons, and we flew into Kuwait that way. Our Bradleys met us over there later on boat. The second deployment, we actually flew over on a commercial airline with stewardesses, flew into Kuwait, and then when we landed in Kuwait, we were received at the airport by buses with the curtains pulled. Only one man on the entire bus, had a whole total of 10 rounds to escort yourself from where you were going from the airport all the way to where they had us, I believe. I can't even remember the name of the place in Kuwait, the first place we stopped at. But that was our biggest difference there. But it was a little different going over as an entire brigade. You go over, you have some unit cohesion, so to speak, versus, where you're flying with everyone you know. So it was a little different for us.
Your first tour, how many months was your first tour?
Our first tour, from the time we were activated to the time we actually returned home, was a little over 18 months. We did 12 months in theater. Second tour, we did 10 months in theater.
Thanks. Afghanistan?
Okay, well, in Afghanistan, when 9/11 hit, I was on terminal leave. I was part of a MU. We were supposed to do a med float or a med deployment. Once that happened, 9/11, we got recalled pretty fast to come on base. And I remember when we deployed, we pretty much, everyone was scrambling because of the high alert nature, and we weren't too sure of the specifics with the attack onto the United States with 9/11. But they pretty much rushed us to go back on the Bataan, which was the ship that I was on at the time. And they put us out on the coast, and then we were able to come back around, I think, September the 14th, to come back on the coast to grab more of our medical equipment, take the straggler Marines that were off on leave, and then we shipped off directly to Afghanistan. We went in country right after Thanksgiving, because I remember having my turkey meal. And then we deployed out via the helicopter in country in Camp Rhino in Afghanistan in 2001. That deployment lasted about 11 months to us, because we kind of had to wait until we were replaced by the Army. We saw a lot of action down there. We were the only conventional forces out there, so working with a lot of special operations commands, both on the United States level and Allied forces, was interesting. As far as personal equipment, we didn't really have much, but because we were part of the tip of the spear, it was kind of like a Marine's wish list or infantryman's wish list. because we pretty much got NVGs, body armor, additional weapons and ammo, all the medical gear I can ever have. I never had a deployment like the first one. I got deployed out in Iraq in '03. That time I did the whole plane thing that took about a day. I slept most of it. And as far as specialized training to deal with the natives and stuff, the first go around, because there was, because I was a corpsman, so not only did I treat our service members and stuff, the whole, like, be right with the minds, to win the minds of the community and stuff that we were engaging in with the Afghans or the Iraqis. We would set up like sick calls and give shots and do basic medical training or medical treatment and stuff like that. So a lot of times we would grab any female service member, regardless of whether or not, wherever they came from the Air Force, Navy, the Army, the Marine Corps, or one of the foreign armies that were with us, we would grab them with us physically to be there so we can treat the females that we had at the battalion aid station or whatever field hospital we ended up setting up. So that was like some specialized on-the-job training that we did on those first couple of deployments.
Along this same line, let me back up just a little bit. When we got to Vietnam, that was before, it was before Skype and email and so forth. Basically, we had the free letter. We could write a letter home free. Whoever wrote you back had to pay for the stamp and so forth. And did you ever use that Mars radio where you go in and hello, over, and so forth?
No, it was just handwritten letters is the only thing I ever had access to. And then, matter of fact, I got called up to the command one time for not writing home enough. It was pretty much the only way you had of any kind of communication that I knew of. I was pretty low on the totem pole. There may have been other ways of doing things, but I wasn't privy to them.
All right, how about Gulf War II there?
So pretty much in '04, it was still a lot of hard mail coming in. I remember the battalion sergeant major had a satellite phone, and that was supposed to be for the whole battalion, and it got rotated around. You got one shot at it for 5 minutes. If you were lucky, 5 minutes per month. Email didn't get established for a couple of months, and then when it did get established, you got 5 minutes once a month, and by the time you answered one email, your 5 minutes was gone. Second deployment was different in '09. By '09, civilization was very well established. You had internet, you had Skype, you have everything that the current soldiers are experiencing now on their deployment. So, you actually had to worry about being too connected back home, because I remember a time where I was actually Skyping with my wife in 2009 at a time we actually received mortars, and I had to tell a little white lie as to what the booms were in the background. And I said, I'll call you right back. I'll be right back in a little bit. So it definitely had its pluses and its minuses.
Afghanistan?
So with us and stuff like that, we want basic mail, hard mail and stuff like that. We took MREs, wrote down free postage on it and sent it on home. Later on, like in the deployment and stuff like that, we had some electronic stuff, like with email, mostly the snail mail, email kind, as far as like Yahoo and that kind of thing. We didn't really have that much social media or the internet capabilities as later deployments, but I've experienced that too as well.
Another question I want to follow up real quick. I was regular Army. Let's see, Andrew, you were regular Army. You were National Guard?
Yes, sir. I was regular Army in the beginning, but when I deployed both times, I deployed with the National Guard.
National Guard. And you were regular Marine, or actually regular Navy. Okay.
Navy/FMF with the Marines.
Okay, all right. What I brought up was there was a few National Guard units were deployed, and I think a couple of reservist units were deployed to Vietnam, but it was mostly regular military.
There were some special forces units that I remember seeing some photos of, things like that came from National Guard, but nothing from North Carolina that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
So,
You got
I had a follow-up on that too about communication. A lot of time we'd get our information from the Stars and Stripes, which I think a lot of you probably know about. It's the newspaper that the military puts out. I remember sitting under a little palm tree, coconut tree, banana tree, something like that. I remember, and reading of the death of one of them. They had the names of all the people KIA'd that week. And remember reading one of my hometown buddies that I'd played baseball with coming up through school had been KIA'd. He was Marine at the time. But that was another way we'd get. I actually saw one news article from my home that my family sent me where our unit had been conducting an operation and had gotten ambushed, and had the ambush was tripped by a young lady somehow that was in there. But there was a story back there about it, but I never saw anything about it. I knew we had a firefight that day, but didn't know any of the details about it. But they sent me the family sent me a newspaper clipping about that fight at one time. So there was. But other than that, handwriting letters and those type things was about the only thing you had any kind of communication with.
You know, another thing, and I know it's true for Vietnam veterans, but I want to get it for y'all. Depending on what year you were in country, what your job was, and where you were assigned, all of our stories are different. But two things that all Vietnam veterans basically relate to: heat and humidity and the smells. When that plane door opened and that humidity came in, I knew that I put in tobacco in North Carolina. I'm a North Carolina native, and I thought it was hot but when that plane door opened and those smells came in, which are unique to themselves, I knew I was not in North Carolina. That's pretty much, we all remember those.
It was the same as walking into an oven when I got off of that plane that day. And I remember it just as today. And I walked down onto the tarmac, and it hit you in the face. It sure did.
Yeah. How about in Gulf War II? I guess it was hot there. Y'all hot and cold though.
Well, depending on where you were, I can only speak for Iraq. I can't speak for Afghanistan. But in Iraq was a little different. So, the further north you were, the colder it was. Obviously, you experienced winter up north. The further south you were, the hotter it was. One thing about Iraq, though, is I try to tell everybody how to relate to the heat is turn your oven on. If you had somebody on the inside that could actually turn a hairdryer on to blow that heat in your face, that's Iraq. That's how hot Iraq was as far as it goes on that. As far as smells, I think those smells will last me for the rest of my life. Those are smells you'll never forget. Everything from the smell of burning sewage in the early 04 days when we burned our own sewage, all the way up to the burn pits that we're all here in the news today, because that's what we did. We burned everything that we created, to include the smell when you're doing foot patrols through the towns and the local villages of raw sewage that ran through the streets. So those smells will last with you a lifetime.
And since you covered Iraq, I'll just stick with Afghanistan. It was pretty much hot down in southern Afghanistan and stuff like that. What was surprising was how freaking cold it was, freezing-wise, especially up in the high altitude areas, up in the mountains and stuff, the cliff faces and just the overall the smells of not only of the burning pits and stuff like that. What was unique about Afghanistan, there was a lot of drugs, with opium and all kinds of stuff that was floating around and about. And as we went along, they told us to burn that in addition to all the stuff that we carried with us too. So that was interesting, but it was extremely cold. So being both part of Afghanistan, cold and hot in Iraq, I definitely like my climate control.
Well, I was around Saigon in Vietnam, and it got down to 65 one time. I've never been so cold in my life. And you were farther up around Way, I believe.
Well, we were the Central Highlands mostly, where it was pretty hot all the time. But then just before Tet Offensive in '68, we moved up to Way during the monsoon, and it get down to in the 40s at night. But it was really, really cold, especially with staying out there. You'd been so used to hot weather, but it really was hot, cold, and miserable, and wet and damp. But I'm sure nothing like some of these places some of these guys have been either. We had tents at that time, but you still spend a lot of time out in the field as well, dug in a hole, sleeping.
Right. Our next question would be rules of engagement. And I thought the rules of engagement in Vietnam were bad, but from what I've read and so forth and talked to these guys, it's worse. Let me give you, I'll make sure I got it right. I did some research today. According to the rules of engagement, which consumed 26 congressional recorded pages, this is Vietnam, American soldiers were under orders not to shoot first, but to wait until fired upon. If a pilot saw a MiG on the ground, he couldn't attack. He had to wait until it was airborne and showing hostile intent. If a surface-to-air missile launch site was under construction, he couldn't bomb it. He had to wait until it was operational. Trucks more than 200 yards off the Ho Chi Minh Trail couldn't be bombed. They could just have to go and leave them alone. We never really went into North Vietnam. We never blockaded Haiphong Harbor, which is where the 90% of all North Vietnamese stuff came in. All kinds of different layers. The United States wanted to make sure that as few civilians as possible was killed. So when they were going to do a bombing run on Hanoi or whatever, they would tell the Swiss they were going to do a bombing run, knowing that the Swiss would in turn tell North Vietnam that we were going to do a bombing run so they could supposedly get the civilians out of the way, which they did never do because they wanted the civilians to get killed for propaganda. And American planes flew basically the same route at the same time every day. So if you were a gunner for North Vietnam, you knew when to stop your break because it was time for the Americans to come in. Most of our POWs from Vietnam War were pilots and navigators from the airplanes because there have been so many shot down and so forth. But down where I was, we had the Mission Rubber Plantation, and sometimes you couldn't shoot back because you might hit a rubber tree and sap run out. Part of the problem also was that the people in D.C. decided what was a friendly village and what was a bad village. Now, you could go on patrol through this village, and every day something would happen to one of you guys. But someone in Pentagon, or actually in Washington in the president's office, whatever, decided that was a friendly village. You couldn't do anything about it. The next village you go to every day, and the kids come out and bring you a pineapple or sell you a Coca-Cola or whatever, but that was decided by somebody along the line that that was an unfriendly village, so you could do what you wanted to pretty much in that. So the rules of engagement, like I said, the bad guys, the communists could go into Laos and Cambodia. We couldn't go in there and touch them. So all they had to do was run across the line and go, yeah, 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 you can't touch us. So the rules of engagement for us was pretty strict. Andrew, you want to follow up on that?
Well, at my level, like I say, I wasn't really very familiar with a lot of that stuff. It was just that if we got shot at, we shot back for the most part. And a lot of times the VC knew that, so they would station themselves in a small village somewhere and wait for us to come through in a patrol or something and then attack us, and then they would run and deed him out. We'd come in and blow up the village with aerial artillery or ourselves or whatever, and I think that was their whole purpose, was to get us to come in there and blow up the village. But I was never really privy to what we couldn't and couldn't do. I saw a lot of different things done that I probably wouldn't have done myself, but we never actually were preached at about what to do, what not to do that much, at my level anyway.
Yeah, the Vietnamese were kind of, villages were caught in a hard place there because the Americans would come through and treat them harshly because they had helped the Viet Cong. The Americans would leave, the Viet Cong would come in and treat them harshly because they had talked to the Americans. Someone came up with the idea, though, let's take this entire village, let's pick it up with their pigs, everything, cows, everything, chickens and everything, and let's move it 100 miles away. But the problem was that most of the people in Vietnam were Buddhist, and Buddhists are very family-oriented. So you move them back to this 100 miles away, well, they want to be with their ancestors. So quite often, just as soon as the plane dropped them off with all their family and cows and so forth, they'd head right back to the other area. That area, once we moved them all, would be considered a free fire zone. You could do whatever you wanted to, drop bombs or whatever, but the villages are quite often moved back in. To Gulf War II, that same question, your rules of engagement.
So in '04, when we got over there, it was pretty much still the Wild West. You didn't have to wait for the enemy to shoot at you. If you identified them as a threat, you could engage the enemy up front. You had free call for fire. I could call in sorties. I could call in fast movers. You know, I pretty much had everything at our disposal, you know, in '04. And actually in '04, we would actually do H&I fires, a lot of things that we was learned from Vietnam. So if we took the enemy would actually set up mortars in the palm groves and with mortars from the palm groves. So what we would do is we would take the Bradleys and put the Bradleys on the berms, and at a set time at night, once we figured out we were always getting hit, say at 1900 at night, we would do an H&I fire and we'd let loose probably about 20, 30 HE rounds into the wood line of the palm grove. And what that did is that just changed the enemy's TTP, but it always kept him on his heels by doing the H&I fires.
H&I fires, that was harassment and interdiction?
That's exactly what it was. And
we,
then,
we used to call it a mad minute.
And pretty much that's what it turns into. And then as we started receiving mortars, we actually got a Q-36 radar in there, and we actually started firing counter battery in '04. So we started out with 120 millimeter mortars, then when we graduated up to 105 howitzers and started making a real big loud statement. In 2009, all that changed. Literally, you could not fire your weapon unless someone fired at you, and you could positively identify that what they were doing was trying to kill you. And when I say you couldn't fire your weapon, I mean literally if you did, they would launch an investigation the moment you got through just to make sure that you followed all the proper rules of engagement procedures before you fired your weapon. To include, if you were a gunner on top of a truck, making sure that you exercised your non-lethal rounds before you used your lethal rounds, which could consist of anything from a pin flare to rubber bullets in a 12-gauge shotgun prior to actually engaging with a 50 cal or 7.62 if you're on top of a truck. That's a huge change from '04 to '09 going to that.
Did they actually have to be firing at you, or just have a weapon, or what was the?
In '04, you didn't have to worry about those engagement criteria. In '09, they literally had to be hitting your truck to fire back. They couldn't just be shooting in your area. You literally had to be positively engaged, and multiple people had to witness it for you to actually do it. You couldn't actually do what you did in '04 because it became that crucial, because the enemy didn't wear uniforms and he blended in. So, you know, a lot of times the anti-coalition forces actually used that to their advantage. They would come around the corner, they would spray a couple rounds, and then they would try to get you to engage. So the only way that we could actually mediate that was literally to tell our guys to hold their fire, and unfortunately that come from higher.
So if they were shooting at you, then they just laid their rifle down beside the building and walked off.
You couldn't kill them.
You couldn't shoot them.
No, sir.
Not
Not
supposed to.
Not '09, but '04 they got smoked.
That's.
And then the difference, another difference with that too is by the time, you know, 2004 goes, you know, it's the Wild West. That's the way we like to refer to it. And in 2009, it was so restrictive. I can remember right there toward the end in 2010 before we left, the largest caliber weapon I was allowed to carry on any of my vehicles was 7.62. Prior to that, it was 50 cal, AT4, Mark 19, whatever I wanted to have on that truck, I could roll just as heavy as I wanted to roll. We got so limited to where it's like when the enemy engaged us, if he engaged us from a concrete position, I no longer had the ability to defeat that concrete.
7.62, that was the 16, M16?
That was actually, would have been your era, would have been the M60, but for us, it would have been the M240 Bravo.
Right, yeah.
Matter of fact, so in 2004, I rolled in Bradleys. In 2009, I wasn't allowed to roll in Bradleys. My Bradleys stayed parked, ready for what was called a Thunder Run, but it took an 06 or higher to authorize that Bradley to actually be cycled and actually rolled out that gate. So we had to go very, very scaled back in '09 as we were starting to transition and give the authority back over to the Iraqis. But we still had to have the same presence that we had in '04, and we still had to be at that gate running missions daily, still out there trying to find the bad guys.
What if you had to call in helicopter or planes for support? I mean,
so the difference in calling in your support from '04 to '09 was the difference of whether or not they fired. They had to have positive ID on the target before they could launch a Hellfire missile out of an Apache. In '04, not so much. All you had to do was just mark them, and once you marked the target, they could pretty much start firing on the target. In '09, it was a different story. It was more a show of force than it was actual use of force in '09.
And to clarify, an 06 is a brigadier general, a one-star general. That's just elevating it way too high.
Afghanistan.
Well, in Afghanistan, that was '01, '02, and then when I was in so we didn't really have, like, our rules and engagements were pretty much simple. Fired upon, shoot back. If we felt threatened, we went ahead and engaged with the enemy and stuff like that. We had all the capabilities. We were able to call in strikes if need be, call in CASEVAC, medevacs, whatever, because I was mostly on the medical side, so they tend to keep me back in the rear. But as far as like roles and engagement, they were pretty much simplified for us. The only thing they mentioned in a lot of the briefs and stuff and warning our Marines and everybody that went into theater in Afghanistan was beware of mosque, religious buildings, and then also the red crescents as far as like ambulances and stuff. But then we found out they were starting to attack us with these ambulances with the red crests, so we were kind of wary of it. So most of the time, if they didn't follow instructions or wouldn't wave down, we ended up firing first before being attacked. And most of the time, we were right. Actually, all the time, whenever they were trying to do that, but you never know.
Yeah. What kind of terrain were you fighting in Afghanistan? Was it, you see on the news, it seems like it's nothing there but mountains and so forth?
Well, in Afghanistan in '01, at the time that I was deployed, we were coming in from the sea into a landlocked area. So we flew in to gain an airstrip in the southern part of Afghanistan, and that was more of a desert environment. Then we pushed ourselves up towards the middle of Afghanistan, which is Kandahar, up in more of like a city environment and stuff like that with a lot of buildings and houses. And then from there we went up to coast, which was further up north, and then up into the mountains. So we pretty much went everywhere in Afghanistan in a relatively quick amount of time. So we weren't in one place at one time for a long period of time. We were just pushing and pushing as far as we can go.
So you had a desert area as well as mountainous areas.
Yes.
Gulf War II, a tree, it looks like over there would be unusual to find a whole lot of trees. What kind of terrain did y'all have, and as far as foliage and so forth?
Well, Iraq was a little different, just depending on what region of Iraq, based off of the actual terrain, what you had to deal with. In '04, we were in the northern portion of the Dala province, so we were actually in an area that was your smaller cities, your smaller villages. A village may consist of 5 buildings, it may consist of 30 buildings. The house may be made from mud or it may be made from grease cans, just depending on how they created the house. In '09, we were in East Rashid district of Baghdad, so that's a total different story. Now you've actually got several stories of concrete buildings, just like what you would find, in most of your bigger metropolitan areas. As far as trees, the traditional tree you'll find is either going to be a eucalyptus tree, and most of the eucalyptus trees were actually, or it's their version of a eucalyptus tree, will be where a lot of their military boats were prior to. Everything else is pretty much the standard palm grove. Within the palm grove, the way they have, they're flooded and everything. Sometimes there may be an understory of pomegranates, but most of the time it was just an understory of just dirt underneath the palm groves. So vegetation for the most part, unless you were in some of the areas like down around Baghdad, around the riverfront areas, it was pretty vegetated down there because obviously you had water. So anytime there was water, you had a little more vegetation. 90% of the time, though, it was just very, very dry and very, very open.
Well, down where I was, down in the Delta area, it was swamp. You didn't wear underwear because you end up with rashes. Uniform could rot off of you in a couple of months. We walked one day and it was always on roots above water. Now you were up in Way, it was a little more up in the Central Highlands.
There was kind of flat planed in the Central Highlands, flat planed rice paddies, accented by great big rocks or hills or mountains that were maybe 1,000 feet tall or something like that, maybe a few more bigger ones than that, but it would just be dropped down straight, flat, and then the ocean is where I was, pretty much near the Red China
Vietnam
Sea.
was a long, narrow country. It has mountainous area, it has the foothills, I guess you'd call it, Central Highlands, and then down the swamps. Right. And the weather's a little bit different in each one. But terrain is, you could be in the swamps one day, and the next day you could be in the Central Highlands with the Montagnards and so forth.
Right.
All right. Next subject would be coming home. I'm not certain. You were a little later than me. When I came home from Vietnam, I got on that plane. Again, didn't know anybody on the plane. We were coming home, and I'd be honest with you, I didn't breathe a whole lot until that pilot said, because I knew the military was going to turn that plane around. When the pilot finally said, "We have left Vietnam airspace," I was able to breathe because I just knew they were going to turn back around and go back to Benoit. Actually, I left out of Tonsanut in Saigon this time. But I got home to California, and they were just beginning to have problems with protesters and so forth. And they had suggested we might want to take our uniform off and come rest of the way home in civilian clothes. Andrew, were you a little later? How bad was it with the protesters?
Well, I came home in '68, and
well, that's right, about the same time.
I wore uniform home and flew into, I think it was Fort Bliss. No, not Bliss.
I came in through Travis Air Force Base.
Yeah, in Washington.
No,
Washington or Oakland,
no, I came in through right straight into California.
Yeah, I was into Washington or Oregon. I cannot remember now, to be honest with you. I used to thought I'd never forget it. But anyway, we stayed there overnight for a day or so, did our process, and got new clothes, all that sort of stuff. Then I got on the plane, flew to Chicago, then Atlanta, and then to Raleigh. And matter of fact, I was sat between two business guys. It was a commercial flight. I don't remember any other soldiers on the flight. And we got to Chicago, had a layover, and they offered to buy me a drink. They were very friendly and nice business guys. As a matter of fact, they had to buy me a drink because I wasn't old enough to buy it myself. So, and I was real bad with it at the time, so I had a Tom Collins because I'd never had a mixed drink in my life before. But so I knew that name from movies. So I would ask them for a Tom Collins. But anyway.
Yeah, when I came home, I still had military time. You still had military time. So we were surrounded by military as the ones who came home, who got out immediately and went back into civilian life. I think had the problems. I was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, and it was more Vietnam vets returning home there than I think there were anything else. So we didn't have to worry about a whole lot of protesters.
Right. And being from North Carolina, and then I went to South Carolina for a while I was home on leave. You know, there was not, you had a better lot less protesting in these two states, so I never experienced anything like that pretty much. And my family was very supportive of everything, but yeah, I never ran into anything like that or being spit on or cussed at or anything like that.
Well, the thing about Vietnam, you could actually be in the jungle one day, and the next day you could almost be asking Mama to pass the blanket of blank potatoes.
Well, I'll tell you one thing I remember in depth, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. We were been humping for about 3 days, camping out, sleeping in the woods, in the jungle, and we were walking down this trail, and we stopped, took a break, and about 10 minutes later, this young lady comes walking up the trail in front of us, towards us, with a basket under her arm, and we had not seen people for 3 or 4 days. Didn't know how far out in the jungle we were, where we were. She had a basket of filled with ice and ice cold Coca-Colas in a bottle that she charged everybody 50 cents for one of them. And I remember getting one. And she might have been counting our numbers or something like that, but it just struck me as being the strangest thing. We were in the middle of a war, in the middle of the jungle, hadn't seen people for 3 or 4 days, and she comes walking out of the jungle with ice cold Coca-Colas in the bottle. Well, I never tasted anything so good in my life.
Now, one of the things, though, as I pointed out just a minute ago, there was no cooling off time. You could be in the jungles of Vietnam in combat, and within a day or so, you're back at home trying to readjust yourself to. Well, we had a very unique, very colorful language in Vietnam, to say the least. And you're coming home, and Mama didn't always appreciate the way you had learned to speak in Vietnam. But there was no downtime, no readjustment time. You went immediately from the jungles of Vietnam or wherever you were in Vietnam back to the world or normal, whatever normal was. Go for it, two. Did you, as far as coming home, how did you come home? Did you have did they have someone to meet you and kind of give you some ease you in some way rather than coming straight back from combat into?
So you would cycle down from Iraq down into Kuwait, and you never knew how long it was going to take once you got down into Kuwait, as far as how long it was going to be for you to fly over. I remember You know, our big push in '04 was to try to get everybody home for Christmas. I think that lasted a whole week, and then we realized it was going to be probably late January before we actually made it home. So you would get down into Kuwait. You know, you could be there a week, you could be there 3 weeks, just depending on when the Air Force could actually line up all the Air Force to get everybody home. You would go back in waves. They tried to keep as much unit integrity as possible to send us back. Once you got back stateside, then you went to a demobilization site. Could be Fort Bliss, could be Fort Bragg, could be Fort Stewart, anywhere along those lines. That usually was about a 15-day process of just basically making sure that everything is taken care of before you exit off of active duty. Then from there, they put you on buses. You went back to your specific army you were from. My unit, our infantry company, we were from Smithfield, North Carolina. They sent us home, and then just like that, we were back introduced into the world. The bad part about that is during that demobilization time frame is they didn't really prepare Joe to get ready for what he was going to walk back into when he got back home. And I say that because we were used to combat and having to identify everything from a piece of trash on the side of a road to a dead dog on the side of the road, anything that inherently could have a bomb hidden in it. So when we got back home, because that wasn't addressed in the demob sites early on in '04 like it was later on, we caught a lot of our guys and ourselves, myself to be included, driving down the center of the road, which was perfectly fine in Iraq, but not fine in the States. There was a lot of things that, though they tried to get us ready for that, you know, integration back into society, you know, they really missed the mark on a lot of things, but it was unique things that I don't know that anybody had the foresight to actually really, you know, gauge us on and kind of make sure we were ready for that.
Well, at least you had a mark. We didn't have a mark. We made our own mark. And we came over and came back as individuals. We didn't have buddies to kind of talk to and decompress, or whatever you want to call it. Afghanistan, same question.
Well, in Afghanistan, particularly with Marine units, they tend to go on board ship. Like, they arrive on board ship, they come back on board ship. Only sometimes they actually fly back on airlines. But the first 2 deployments I was in were a little bit different from what my colleague was explaining, like '04 and '09 and stuff like that. When we got home, we actually had to transit into like Rota, Spain to like wash down the ship, wash down our equipment and stuff like that. And they didn't exactly trust us to go on shore leave to the country, but they ended up doing what they call a steel beach like atmosphere, where we got some downtime and decompress off the shit onto what we call like a steel beach, where they had tents, music, actual real life food that wasn't like, you know, from the mess halls or T-Rats. And then we finally got home. What's unique about the deployment in 2001 was because we were the first conventional force in, we were the first ones coming back home. So pretty much the nation knew that we were coming home. So there was a lot of national press when I remember when we landed and we were in formation, and then they called us all heroes and they dismissed us, and then we got bombarded with like all our family coming up to us, and like the community was out there, the politicians, the national news and stuff like that. But what was weird about it is that most of us was granted leave as soon as we got dismissed. So my parents greeted me up on the flight deck that I was on, and I went straight to Washington, D.C. We stopped over at a mall called Potomac Mills as a layover before I actually went into Fort Washington, and I realized immediately as soon as I was walking into the mall that I was getting anxiety-filled, complaining about like the general public had no idea about the things that we saw, all smiles and cheers. My parents kind of separated from me, so I felt a little anxiety-filled. So I saw a bunch of recruiters, and I just went in there and just started talking to the folks that was in there because I felt comfortable there. So we didn't really have like a DMOB or a PDRHA that I do now for a living with the Vet Center program like I did when I first deployed out in '01, '02, and then '03, '04 and stuff like that. So
Now, you were wounded?
yeah, I got that was off my 3rd deployment, just at the very beginning. I don't even really call like being deployed out the 3rd time because I came back home immediately thereafter. I was starting to have like symptoms of like not really doing my job as a corpsman, more related to my PTSD and TBI, but no one knew it was more my TBI. As a corpsman in Afghanistan, I was part of some significant battles. We had some ordnance down there, in Afghanistan, and then I got unlucky and was part of the battle out in Azariah with the Tigris and Euphrates, the whole Bloody Sunday. So I was one of those that deployed back to back to back, and knowing that these IEDs, mines, and multiple explosions were actually causing something wrong. Luckily, I was in the medical field, so a lot of the doctors pretty much recommended, he's not normal for what was going on. And even on that first deployment, I had such a hard time that my command, both on the Marine Corps side and Navy side, actually identified that I had PTSD and a lot of substance abuse issues. I just got voluntold to do some of the proactive stuff by seeing psychology, psychiatry, and then also going to substance abuse without a voice or say into it. My command just made me do it. But in turn, that kind of helped me out because I was a corpsman, so a lot of the guys I was with ended up talking to me about their issues. So it would be just conversations between me and them, knowing that I was going through treatment. So it was like treating them without getting professional treatment, which probably I shouldn't have done.
We're going to get into your job today shortly. What you do is for the troops. And you got something you want to follow up on?
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that during the Gulf Wars and part of the taskings in 07, 08, when it started, you think about it, as far as deployments go, they come home as a unit or come home as an individual. And then the active component, they were fortunate enough to they would go home for a couple of weeks, be on leave, come back. They got everything in the world they need on that base that they need for help, counseling, advice, all that type of thing. But the Guard and Reserve guys, when they would come home from a deployment, they would come back to their armory, have their little ceremonies, and then they would go home. They may be the only soldier in that town that's been in the military, that's ever been deployed. They may be 150 or 200 miles away from a military base. They have no support whatsoever. So fortunately, Congress got together in 07, 08, and developed what they call the Yellow Ribbon Program. And it brings, what they were finding out is when that soldier went home, they could not touch him for 90 days. That was 90 days that soldier was all alone by himself. Nobody that, he may not have any friends locally that understood what he had been through. So they came up with the Yellow Ribbon Program in, I think, 07, made it official. Congress designated that National Guard Bureau would host these events. So they started bringing these soldiers back within 30 days. And they started eliminating a lot of those problems because those soldiers that these guys can speak to this better than I can, but when they got back with their buddies, they found that support group with them, so they were able to handle things a little bit better. They got home, and then that 90-day period, they found out the spouse could live without them. They could do things that they, on their own, they didn't need them as quite as bad as they thought they might have. But I'm just saying that's one example. But many problems came up in one of those 90 days. So they found that getting them back sooner with their comrades that had suffered through the same things they had was better for them mentally, and they got along better, and they had far less problems. So I think it's really important to bring this up because that Yellow Ribbon Program does make a big difference. They do a 30-day, they do events before they go, obviously, but they do a 30-day event when they come back, gets them back quicker. Then they do the 60, 90-day PDHRAs that Moses is really involved with. I'm involved with all of them, but it's made a world of difference of how these soldiers cope from those deployments and the after actions of coming home and finding out things are a lot different, or maybe better, maybe worse, but it's different when they come back. And so this helps them cope with it a lot better. This program's been very successful.
Thank you for tuning in to this part of the program. We will have the continuation and final parts of this symposium on the 26th of July. I hope you found tonight's part very interesting. I learned a great deal myself and saw their problems as well as our problems, and we all had our own individual problems. but as obviously the military has gotten better and learned a lot of things from the Vietnam War and from the Gulf War One. They learned a great deal, and there's a whole lot of help out there, but we're still having a lot of problems. So this was the rebroadcast. If you saw that Channel 4, I also did the recording, and they showed it on their show on one of their PBS stations a couple weeks ago. So be sure to tune in 8 o'clock on the 26th of July, and we'll finish up the symposium and get some good information. And I hope you found some entertainment as well as good information. And thank you so much for tuning in. And good night.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.